Отлично. Давайте начнем это захватывающее историческое повествование. Я буду писать по одной
Бортмеханики
части,
едут на крыльях,
около
чтобы
8000
помочь. Это
символов.
должны быть в воздухе.
После каждой спрашивать, готовы ли вы продолжить. The Ugly Giant. How the P-47 Thunderbolt silenced the Luftwaffe. A story of iron,
Берем самолет.
fire,
Никто
and
из
the
них
man
не
who
знает,
flew
что
the
их ждет.
Juggernaut. Part 1. The Beast They Laughed At. The winter of 1942 came down hard on the airfields of England. Frost crept across the concrete runways at dawn, and the mechanics of the 56th Fighter Group breathed clouds of vapor into the gray Suffolk air as they crowded around something that had just been unloaded from a crate the size of a small barn. Standing nearly 15 feet tall at the tip of its 12-foot propeller, the Republic P-47 Thunderbolt squatted on its wide undercarriage like a prize fighter who had eaten too many meals and wasn't ashamed of it. It weighed over 7 tons fully loaded, nearly twice as much as the nimble Supermarine Spitfire that the Royal Air Force pilots flew with such elegant confidence. Its nose was dominated by a massive Pratt & Whitney R2800 double
В битве
wasp
за
radial
Германию
engine,
главное единство.
18 cylinders arranged in 2 rows, each cylinder larger than a man's head. The whole machine had the aerodynamic grace of a beer keg. The RAF pilots who wandered over from the neighboring dispersal bays looked at it and raised their eyebrows. Some smiled politely. The Americans who would fly it said little, because there was not much flattering to say. Captain Walker Mahurin, a sharp-eyed young man from Indiana, who would go on to become one of the top American aces in the European theater of operations, recalled years later that his first impression of the Thunderbolt was that someone in Long Island had designed a flying radiator and accidentally put a cockpit on top. The joke that circulated among the pilots was straightforward. If you had to bail out of a P-47, you would die of old age before you fell far enough to pull the ripcord. The plane, they said, fell like a safe. The Germans heard about it too. Luftwaffe pilots, the men of the Jagdgeschwader units who had been flying since the campaigns over Poland in 1939 and the Battle of Britain in 1940, received intelligence reports about the new American fighter by the late summer of 1942. The description made them smile. A 7-ton fighter? A radial engine so large the pilot could barely see over it? The Focke-Wulf FW-190, which had shocked the RAF in the autumn of 1941 with its superior roll rate and firepower, was a marvel of compact engineering. The Messerschmitt Bf-109, the spine of the Jagdwaffe sent Spain, was a lean, hungry thoroughbred. Against these refined instruments of aerial combat, the P-47 seemed like a joke with wings. Major Egon Mayer, one of the FW-190 pilots of Jagdgeschwader 2, Richthofen, stationed in France, is said to have laughed openly when his intelligence officer described the American machine. He had accumulated dozens of aerial victories against the RAF and had developed precise, brutal tactics for attacking American Boeing B-17 Flying Fortress bombers head-on, where the defensive armament was weakest. He was not afraid of the Thunderbolt. Neither were the other experienced Experten, the word the Luftwaffe used for their top-scoring pilots, who had spent 3 years learning every trick the sky had to teach. They were all wrong. But it would take blood and fire and months of brutal combat before anyone fully understood why. The 56th Fighter Group, based at Halesworth in Suffolk, received its first P-47Cs in January of 1943. The group's commanding officer was Colonel Hubert Zemke from Missoula, Montana, a former pre-war exchange pilot who had flown with both the RAF and the Soviet Air Forces and understood aerial combat not as a game of instinct, but as a science to be mastered with discipline and intellect. Zemke had tested the P-47 extensively at Wright Field in Ohio and had come away with a different perspective than most of his contemporaries. He did not see the Thunderbolt as a fat, clumsy beast. He saw a machine of immense potential that simply had to be understood on its own terms. The way you had to understand a heavy draft horse before you could work with it. Not like a thoroughbred, but
Плюс
powerful
два
in ways a
запасных
thoroughbred could
должны
never
подняться
be.
в воздух.
The plane's official designation was Republic P-47 Thunderbolt, and the manufacturer was Republic Aviation Corporation of Farmingdale, New York. The chief designer was Alexander Kartveli, a Georgian émigré who had fled the Bolshevik Revolution and brought his extraordinary engineering mind to America, where he would create one of the most durable and lethal combat aircraft in history. Kartveli's genius lay in the turbo supercharger. The R2800 engine could develop 2,035 horsepower at sea level, but at altitude, at 25,000 feet or 30,000 feet, where the thin, cold air starved ordinary engines of oxygen, the GECH5 turbo supercharger forced compressed air back into the intake and maintained power that other fighters simply could not match. Above 25,000 feet, the P-47 woke up. It became something different, something dangerous. The first operational mission took place on the 10th of March, 1943. 12 P-47Cs of the 56th Group crossed the English coast and flew an uneventful sweep over the enemy coast near Walcheren Island in the Netherlands. No Germans appeared. The Thunderbolts returned safely. The British press noted the event without enthusiasm. The Germans noted it with mild curiosity. The early missions were disappointing in a technical sense. The range was brutally limited. With internal fuel only, the P-47C could escort bombers barely as far as the German-Dutch border. Not nearly far enough to protect the 8th Air Force's B-17s and B-24 Liberators on their deepening strikes into Germany. The bombers were going to Schweinfurt and Regensburg and Bremen, and the fighters had to turn back over the Rhine, while the bombers flew on alone into what the crews called the long ride. The loss rates among unescorted bomber formations were catastrophic. On the first Schweinfurt raid of the 17th of August, 1943, 60 flying fortresses out of 230 would not come home. 376 men were listed as killed, wounded, or missing in a single afternoon. The escort problem was the central crisis of the American strategic bombing campaign, and the P-47, for all its altitude performance, seemed unable to solve it. But Hub Zemke was not thinking only about range. He was thinking about tactics, and he was teaching his pilots to think the same way. Every evening after missions, the pilots of the 56th gathered in the briefing room and went over the combat film, frame by frame, debating what had worked and what had killed men. Zemke established a rule: never turn with AFW 190 or BF 109 at low altitude. The P-47 was not built for tight horizontal turning. But above 15,000 feet, especially above 25,000, different story entirely. At altitude, the turbo supercharger gave the Thunderbolt power that the German fighters, particularly the Bf-109G with its high-altitude performance limitations, could not match in a prolonged engagement. And then there was the dive. This was the Thunderbolt's great secret, the thing the German intelligence reports had completely failed to communicate to the laughing pilots of the Jagdgeschwader. The P-47 could dive faster than almost anything flying in 1943. Its massive weight in the thick wing became advantages in a vertical plunge. It accelerated through speeds that tore apart lighter aircraft. Zemke told his pilots, "If a German gets on your tail, push the stick forward and go straight down. You will outrun him. Then, when you have the speed advantage, zoom climb back up and re-engage from a position of energy and altitude." It was a style of fighting that had a name: energy tactics. And in the hands of disciplined men flying a machine built for exactly this purpose, it would prove devastating. The spring of 1943 was a period of learning, of adjustment, of costly mistakes and hard-won lessons. But by April, something was beginning to change over the skies of occupied Europe. The big, ungainly machine that had been delivered in crates to a frostbitten English airfield was starting to find its voice. And when it spoke with 8 50 caliber machine guns. The 15th of April, 1943, began like most spring mornings over Suffolk. Low cloud, a smell of wet earth, and the distant coughing of engines being run up on the hardstands before dawn. The pilots of the 56 Fighter Group ate powdered eggs and drank strong coffee in the mess hall, checked their maps, listened to the weather officer describe conditions over the Channel and the Dutch coast, and then walked out to their aircraft in the gray pre-dawn light with the particular quiet that experienced combat pilots carry with them before a mission. Not fear exactly, but a careful internal stillness, a conserving of attention for what is coming. This mission would be different from the uneventful sweeps of March. The group was assigned to provide withdrawal support for B-17s returning from a strike against the Erle Maschinenwerk engine factory in Antwerp, Belgium. The bombers would be coming home damaged, some with dead and wounded aboard, their formations broken by flak and fighter attack, stragglers falling behind the main stream. Exactly the kind of situation the Jagdwaffe loved to exploit. The German fighters would follow the bombers back toward the coast, picking off the weak ones, and the P-47s would be waiting. Major Don Blakesley led the escort that morning, a lean, hard-driving pilot from Fairport Harbor, Ohio, who had already been flying with the RAF's Eagle squadrons before America entered the war, and who had accumulated combat experience that most of his countrymen were only beginning to build. The formation crossed the English coast at 27,000 feet, the Thunderbolt's exhaust trails threading white lines across the pale blue sky. The R-2800 engines producing a sound that was less a roar than a deep, continuous thunder. Hence the name, though Republic Aviation's marketing department had chosen it for reasons of drama rather than acoustics. Over the Dutch coast near Walcheren, the radio crackled. Bogies, German aircraft, identified as FW-190s from Jagdgeschwader 26, the Abbeville Boys, as the Allied air crews called them. One of the most experienced Jagdgeschwader in the Luftwaffe, men who had been fighting over the Channel since 1940 and who knew every trick, every trap, every nuance of combat over this particular stretch of contested sky. What followed lasted 11 minutes by the combat reports. Lieutenant Bob Johnson, flying as wingman in the second flight, later described the experience in his memoir, Thunderbolt, one of the finest first-hand accounts of fighter combat in the Second World War. Johnson saw the FW-190s come up fast from below, climbing in the characteristic German attack style, a slashing pass from altitude advantage, firing, then breaking away before the escorting fighters could react. One Focke-Wulf came through the formation firing, and Johnson, reacting on instinct, shoved his throttle forward and pulled into a climbing turn. The P-47 groaned, its big engine howling, and for a moment Johnson thought the German had him. Then something happened that the German pilot almost certainly did not expect. The Thunderbolt, at 28,000 feet, with the turbo supercharger singing at full efficiency, simply refused to slow down. It climbed away from the FW-190 with a confidence that no intelligence report had predicted. The engagement ended without confirmed kills on that particular day, but the patterns were becoming clear to the pilots who were paying attention. The P-47 was slower than the FW-190 in level flight below 15,000 feet. It turned less tightly than the Bf-109 at medium altitude. But above 25,000 feet, it was a different machine entirely. And in a dive from high altitude, it was simply superior to everything the Luftwaffe was flying in the spring of 1943. The FW-190, for all its qualities, used an air-cooled BMW 801 radial engine with a single-stage supercharger that lost power rapidly above 20,000 feet. The Bf-109G's DB605 inline engine had a two-stage supercharger, but its aerodynamic limits became apparent in the kind of high-speed dives that the Thunderbolt seemed almost designed to make. The first confirmed aerial victories for the 56th Group came on the 14th of May, 1943, during a fighter sweep over the Dutch coast. Captain Walter Cook of the 61st Fighter Squadron engaged a pair of FW-190s that had been stalking a damaged B-17 lagging behind its formation. Cook attacked from above and behind in a diving pass, the standard Thunderbolt attack geometry that Zemke had been drilling into his pilots for months. Use altitude, convert it to speed, fire from close range, break away before the German wingman can respond. The first FW-190 took hits in the engine and cockpit and went down in a vertical dive that did not recover. The second broke hard and dove for the cloud layer below. Cook did not follow. Another of Zemke's rules. Don't chase them into the weeds. You give up everything that makes the P-47 dangerous. 2 weeks later, on the 29th of May, the 56th Group had its first serious large-scale engagement. Escorting B-17s returning from Saint-Nazaire on the French Atlantic coast, the group encountered approximately 30 FW-190s and Bf-109s from multiple Jagdgeschwader units. The combat lasted 22 minutes and covered 60 miles of sky, from the French coast to the English Channel. When it was over, the group claimed 6 German aircraft destroyed and 3 probably destroyed. 3 P-47s were lost. By the brutal arithmetic of air warfare in 1943, this was considered a favorable exchange. But it was Lieutenant Bob Johnson who provided the day that people would talk about for the rest of the war. On the 26th of June, 1943, Johnson's P-47 was attacked by an FW-190 that put more than 200 rounds into his aircraft. 21 cannon and machine gun hits that shattered his canopy, punched through his hydraulic lines, set his cockpit on fire briefly, and left him flying a machine that by any engineering standard should have been falling in pieces. Johnson could not bail out because his canopy release had been shot away. He could not maneuver because his controls were sluggish and unresponsive. He was bleeding, partially blinded by oil spraying back from a damaged engine fitting, and flying a cripple over occupied Holland at 15,000 feet. The FW-190 pilot, later identified as a veteran Unteroffizier from JG-26, pulled alongside Johnson's stricken Thunderbolt and looked at him. Johnson looked back. The German made a gesture. According to Johnson's account, it appeared to be a salute of some kind, an acknowledgement that the American was finished and that there was no need to expend more ammunition on a dead man. Then the German banked away. Johnson flew that ruined Thunderbolt 200 miles back across the North Sea and landed it at Manston in Kent. The plane was a total write-off. The maintenance crew counted over 200 individual points of damage. But Johnson walked away from it. He had a broken nose from where his face had hit the gun sight, bruised ribs, and a singed eyebrow. He asked for a cup of coffee, filed his combat report, and went to bed. This was the other thing about the P-47 that the German intelligence reports had not emphasized. It could absorb punishment that would destroy a lighter aircraft. The R-2800 engine's air-cooled radial cylinders could take rifle caliber and even some cannon hits and keep running. Unlike liquid-cooled inline engines, which were instantly disabled by a single bullet through the coolant system. The airframe, designed to Kartvelli's characteristically robust specifications, was built with safety margins that seemed almost reckless by European standards. The thick wing that looked so ungainly on the ground was structurally capable of sustaining forces that would fold the wing of a Spitfire. The Thunderbolt was, in the language of the pilots, a hard airplane to kill. Word was beginning to spread through the 8th Air Force's bomber groups. The gunners and navigators and bombardiers who rode the B-17s on the long, dangerous missions into Germany started to notice that when the big P-47s were with them, the German fighter attacks were less bold, less coordinated, less effective. The Jagdwaffe still came, they always came, but the pattern was changing. The Thunderbolts were forcing them to think before they attacked, to calculate angles and altitudes and the odds of getting hit before they got away. In the deadly economy of aerial combat, that hesitation cost lives. By July of 1943, the pilots of the 56th Group were being called Zemke's Wolfpack, a name that Hub Zemke himself considered slightly ridiculous, But that stuck because it was true. They hunted in coordinated formations, covered each other's tails with a discipline that the more individualistic German Experten sometimes found difficult to counter. And they used the P-47's specific advantages: altitude performance, diving speed, rugged construction, 8 50-caliber guns firing 650 rounds per minute each, with a methodical efficiency that was less glamorous than the image of the lone ace, but far more effective. The Germans were not laughing anymore. In the intelligence summaries being compiled at the Luftwaffe's headquarters at Karenhall in Brandenburg, the reports from the Jagdgeschwader commanders in France and the Netherlands were becoming noticeably less confident. The American escort fighters were better than expected. The P-47 was better than expected. The pilots were aggressive and disciplined. The tactics were sound. Major Egon Meyer, the man who had laughed at the description of the fat American fighter, filed a report in August of 1943 that recommended his pilots avoid prolonged engagement with P-47s above 20,000 feet and exercise extreme caution when pursuing them in dives. It was the first written acknowledgement by a senior Luftwaffe combat commander that the Thunderbolt was not a joke. It would not be the last. The autumn of 1943 arrived over England with the particular melancholy that English autumns specialize in. Long gray afternoons, early darkness, the smell of coal smoke drifting across the airfields, and the knowledge, held quietly by every man on every base in Suffolk and Norfolk and Cambridgeshire, that the air war was entering its most dangerous phase. The 8th Air Force was pushing deeper into Germany. The targets were harder, the distances greater, the German defenses more concentrated and more desperate. And the escort fighters, the P-47s of the 56th, the 4th, and the 78th Fighter Groups, were being asked to do something that no fighter had ever been required to do on this scale before: to defeat the world's most experienced and battle-hardened air force over its own territory, in its own sky, at ranges that stretched the Thunderbolt's endurance to its absolute limit. The problem of range had been partially addressed by the summer of 1943 through the introduction of external drop tanks, auxiliary fuel tanks carried under the wings or belly that could be jettisoned before combat. The first pressurized paper drop tanks, holding 75 gallons each, extended the P-47's operational radius from approximately 230 miles to 340 miles. Later, larger 200-gallon tanks would push this further. It was not enough to escort the bombers all the way to Berlin. That would require a different aircraft entirely, one that was already being built in a factory in Inglewood, California. But it was enough to reach the Rhine, enough to cover the bombers through the most dangerous part of their approach, enough to change the arithmetic of survival for the men in the B-17 and B-24s. Hub-Zemke understood that range extensions alone would not win the air battle. What would win it was the systematic destruction of the Luftwaffe's best pilots, men who could not be quickly replaced, men who had accumulated thousands of hours of combat experience since 1939, men whose loss would leave gaps in the German fighter force that inexperienced replacements could not fill. This was the logic that drove the Wolfpack's operations in the autumn of 1943. Not simply to protect the bombers, but to hunt the German fighter force, to force it into combat, and to kill it. The man who embodied this logic most completely was Lieutenant Francis Gabi Gebreski, a pilot from Oil City, Pennsylvania, of Polish descent, whose parents had immigrated to America and whose deep, personal hatred of the Nazi regime gave his aggressiveness in the cockpit a quality that went beyond professional ambition. Gebreski had served briefly with a Polish RAF squadron in England before joining the 56th Group, and he had used that time to study German tactics from men who had been fighting the Luftwaffe since the first day of the war in September 1939. He came back to the 56th with knowledge that most American pilots would take months of combat to accumulate. Gebreski's flying style was a precise expression of everything Zemke had taught about the P-47's capabilities. He was patient in a way that aggressive pilots rarely are, willing to climb to altitude and wait, willing to let a less favorable opportunity pass in order to be in perfect position for the attack that would count. He understood deflection shooting, the art of firing not where the enemy aircraft is, but where it will be when your bullets arrive, with an intuitive precision that his gunnery scores confirmed but could not fully explain. And he had the physical toughness that combat flying at 30,000 feet in an unpressurized cockpit in the European winter demanded without mercy. Oxygen masks that froze to bearded faces, temperatures of minus 50 degrees Celsius outside the canopy and not much better inside. The constant physiological stress of high-G maneuvering in heavy winter flying gear. On the 8th of October, 1943, the 8th Air Force launched its second major strike against Bremen, a city of particular strategic importance because of its submarine construction yards and Focke-Wulf aircraft assembly facilities. 237 B-17 and B-24s participated. The 56th Group provided part of the escort, and it was on this mission that Gebreski recorded his 5th confirmed aerial victory, becoming an ace. He described the engagement in his combat report with the characteristic understatement of men who have learned that what sounds dramatic on paper is usually terrifying in reality. He had dived from 31,000 feet onto a Bf-109G that was positioning to attack a straggling fortress, fired a 2-second burst from approximately 200 yards, observed strikes on the engine and left wing route, and watched the German aircraft enter an uncontrolled spin from which it did not recover. 2 seconds, 200 yards, 6,000 rounds per minute from 8 50 caliber M2 Browning machine guns, each bullet weighing approximately 46 grams and traveling at approximately 890 meters per second. The mathematics of the P-47's firepower were not complicated, but they were final. While Gebreski was building his score with patient precision, Robert Samuel Johnson was doing the same thing, with a style that was almost his mirror opposite. Fast, instinctive, aggressive to the point of recklessness, saved repeatedly by the Thunderbolt's ability to survive damage that would have killed him in a lighter aircraft. By November of 1943, Johnson had 17 confirmed victories, making him the leading American ace in the European theater of operations. He flew with a controlled fury that his wingmen found simultaneously inspiring and terrifying. The kind of pilot who saw an opportunity and committed to it completely, trusting the P-47 to bring him home afterward. The German response to the growing effectiveness of the American escort was to try to neutralize it tactically. The Jagdgeschwader commanders developed several countermeasures. The first was altitude, getting above the P-47 formations before engaging, because even the Thunderbolt's supercharged engine had limits, and a Bf-109G with its nitrous oxide injection system, the GM-1 boost, could reach altitudes above 35,000 feet, where the P-47 became sluggish. The second was timing, attacking the escort at the moment of fuel crisis, when the P-47s were at the limit of their range and forced to turn back for England, leaving the bombers unprotected for the long flight home. The third was concentration, massing large formations of fighters to overwhelm the escorts through sheer numbers before the individual quality of the American pilots could assert itself. None of these tactics was fully successful, and the autumn of 1943 showed why. On the 14th of October, Black Thursday as it entered the history of the 8th Air Force, 229 B-17s attacked the ball-bearing factories at Schweinfurt for the second time, without adequate fighter escort for the deep part of the mission. 60 fortresses were shot down. 600 men were lost. It was the worst single-day loss in the history of American strategic bombing. And it demonstrated conclusively that unescorted bombers could not survive deep penetration missions against a determined and competent enemy air defense. But Black Thursday also demonstrated something else, something that was not immediately apparent in the shock of the losses. In the segments of the mission where the P-47s were present, the German attacks were less effective, the bomber losses lower, and the Jagdwaffe's own casualties significantly higher. The escort was working where it existed. The problem was range, not capability. And the range problem was being solved, slowly, imperfectly, but irreversibly, by the drop tanks and by the North American P-51 Mustang, which was beginning to arrive in England in significant numbers by the end of 1943, and which would eventually provide the very long-range escort that the P-47 could not. This created an interesting dynamic within the fighter groups. The P-51, with its Rolls-Royce Merlin engine and laminar flow wing, was faster than the P-47 in level flight at most altitudes, had significantly greater range, and was more comfortable to fly at medium altitude. Some pilots who transitioned from the Thunderbolt to the Mustang loved it immediately. Others, particularly the pilots of the 56th Group, who had grown up professionally in the P-47 and understood its capabilities with the intimacy of long experience, resisted the transition. Hub Zemke himself kept his group on P-47s longer than most, arguing that the Thunderbolt's ruggedness, firepower, and high-altitude performance made it the better aircraft for the specific mission profiles his group flew. He was right in a specific and important sense. The P-47 and the P-51 were not competing. They were complementary. The Mustang's range made it the ideal deep escort fighter for the long missions to Berlin and beyond. The Thunderbolt's toughness and firepower made it the ideal aircraft for the lower altitude work, strafing missions against airfields, rail yards, and road transport, armed reconnaissance over occupied Europe, the kind of dangerous, low-level, high-attrition work that destroyed expensive aircraft and killed experienced pilots at an alarming rate. The Thunderbolt survived these missions at rates that the Mustang could not match, because a single rifle-caliber bullet through the Mustang's liquid-cooled Merlin engine meant a dead engine and a forced landing in enemy territory, while the P-47's air-cooled R-2800 could keep running after taking hits that would be instantly fatal to any inline-engined aircraft. By November of 1943, the 56th Fighter Group had destroyed more than 200 confirmed German aircraft in the air. The group's losses had been significant, 31 pilots killed or captured. But the exchange ratio was favorable, and more importantly, the quality of the pilots being lost told its own story. The Jagdwaffe was losing Experten, men with 50, 60, 70 aerial victories, men who had been flying since Spain or Poland, irreplaceable repositories of tactical knowledge and combat skill. The Americans were losing pilots too, but America had training programs turning out thousands of new pilots every month, and those new pilots were arriving in England already competent, ready to be shaped by combat experience into something formidable. The Germans were beginning to feel it. Not as a sudden break. The Luftwaffe was too well led, too experienced, too deeply committed to simply collapse, but as a gradual, accumulating pressure. The daily casualty reports landing on the desks at Karenhall and at the Reich Air Ministry in Berlin showed a trend that no amount of optimistic interpretation could disguise. The fighter force was shrinking faster than it could be replenished. The pilots being sent to replace the fallen Experten were younger, less experienced, less effective. They were dying in their first few missions at rates that alarmed even the most hardened operational commanders. Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring, commanding the Luftwaffe from his various headquarters, with a combination of political cunning and operational incompetence that had been the service's curse since the Battle of Britain, responded to the deteriorating situation in his characteristic fashion. He blamed the pilots. He accused them of cowardice, of avoiding combat, of failing to press their attacks home. The Jagdwaffe's commanders, men like Adolf Galland, who had been fighting since 1939 and who knew exactly what was happening and why, were furious. They were not being defeated by cowardice. They were being defeated by numbers, by logistics, by a training pipeline that could not keep pace with losses, and by the growing quality and coordination of the American fighter escort. And at the center of that escort, flying the big, ungainly machine that everyone had laughed at, were the pilots of the Wolfpack, and men like them in the 4th and 78th groups, who had learned their trade in the hardest possible school, and were now teaching the Luftwaffe lessons that it had never expected to receive. The laughter was long gone. What had replaced it, in the briefing rooms of the Jagdgeschwader stationed from France to the Dutch coast to the German border, was something more uncomfortable. A careful, professional respect for an aircraft and a group of men that no one had taken seriously enough, soon enough. The new year of 1944 brought with it a fundamental change in the nature of the air war over Europe. General Henry Hap Arnold, commanding the United States Army Air Forces from Washington, and his operational commanders in England, Lieutenant General Carl Spaatz and Major General Jimmy Doolittle, who took command of the 8th Air Force in January, had arrived at a strategic conclusion that would reshape everything. The Luftwaffe had to be destroyed, not merely in the air, but on the ground, in its factories, on its airfields, in its fuel depots and training schools and maintenance facilities. The bombers would continue to strike deep into Germany, but the fighters, the P-47s and the arriving P-51s, would be unleashed in a new role. One that the aircraft's designers had not originally envisioned, but that the machine's particular qualities made it uniquely suited to perform. They called it ground attack. The pilots called it strafing. The Germans, when they saw what was coming, called it something unprintable. The P-47 Thunderbolt carried 8 M2 Browning 50 caliber machine guns, 4 in each wing, staggered to allow the ammunition feed mechanisms to fit within the wing's thickness. Each gun was loaded with 425 rounds, giving a total ammunition capacity of 3,400 rounds for the entire aircraft. At the combined firing rate of approximately 6,500 rounds per minute, a 1-second burst delivered roughly 108 rounds on target. The 50 caliber round, the cartridge designated M2AP, armor-piercing, could penetrate 23 millimeters of rolled, homogeneous steel armor at 500 yards. A locomotive boiler, an aircraft engine, a fuel truck, a command vehicle, an anti-aircraft gun crew. All of these were within the lethal envelope of a single P-47 making a single pass at treetop height and 500 kilometers per hour. The transition to ground attack was not immediate, and it was not painless. Low-altitude flying over defended territory was a fundamentally different and in many ways more dangerous business than high-altitude escort work. At 30,000 feet, the threats were German fighters and the flak from heavy anti-aircraft batteries, 88mm and 105mm guns that fired shells fused to burst at altitude. These were serious threats, and men died from them regularly. But at 50 feet above the ground, strafing a German airfield or a rail marshalling yard, the threat environment changed entirely. Every soldier with a rifle, every light anti-aircraft crew with their 20mm Flak-Vierling quad mount or their 37mm Flak 36, every armored vehicle with a machine gun on its roof, all of them could engage an aircraft flying that low and that slowly relative to their tracking speed. The losses on strafing missions in the winter and spring of 1944 were severe enough that some group commanders privately considered them unsustainable. But the P-47 absorbed this punishment better than any other fighter in the Allied inventory. The R-2800 engine had already proven in air-to-air combat that it could continue running after taking hits that would kill a liquid-cooled engine instantly. At low altitude, this quality was even more valuable. Captain Quentin Einenson, flying with the 456th Fighter Squadron in the 9th Air Force, the tactical air force that was being built up in England for the coming invasion of France, described in his post-war memoir a strafing mission over a German airfield in northern France where his P-47 took hits from ground fire that punched through the engine cowling, damaged 2 cylinders, and severed an oil line. A Spitfire or a P-51 with that damage would have been on the ground in enemy
Но они не
territory
волнуются,
within
потому
minutes.
что до сих пор их группа
Antonsen flew his Thunderbolt 140 miles back to his base in England, trailing smoke, with oil pressure falling steadily and the engine running rough
пилотом
enough to
занять
shake
место
his
в
teeth.
Титане.
He
Выстраивайтесь
landed
на
it successfully.
взлетно-посадочных
The
полосах.
ground crew counted 11 hits from 20mm cannon rounds. Operation Argument, known to the air crew who flew it as Big Week,
Помните, что
ran from the
сейчас нельзя
20th to the
терять ни
25th of
секунды.
February
Этим
1944,
Thunderbolt'ом
and it represented the most concentrated application of American air power yet attempted against the German aircraft industry. More than 3,000 heavy bomber sorties struck Messerschmitt factories at Regensburg and Leipzig, Focke-Wulf plants at Oschersleben and Tutow, assembly facilities at Brunswick and Gotha. The P-47 groups
И они
flew
всегда
escort for the
говорят
deep
«Удачи,
missions
сэр»,
and
«До
conducted
встречи».
fighter
А
sweeps
иногда
against Luftwaffe airfields simultaneously. The air battles of Big Week were among the largest in history. Hundreds of aircraft on each side engaged across hundreds of miles of German sky on each of the 6 days. The 56th Group's performance during Big Week was extraordinary, even by the standards it had set in the previous year.
задача
On the
истребителя
22nd of
защищать
February,
бомбардировщик.
the group engaged a large formation of Bf-110 Zerstorer, twin-engine heavy fighters that the Luftwaffe used as bomber destroyers, armed with heavy cannon
Через 6
and
минут
unguided
после запуска
rockets
первого
designed to break
двигателя
up bomber formations from outside the defensive gunners' effective range, over central Germany. The Bf-110 was a formidable weapon
два
against
запасных
unescorted
должны
bombers,
подняться в
but
воздух.
against single-engine fighters, it was dangerously slow and unmaneuverable. The Wolfpack tore through the Zerstorer formation with a violence that the combat film, when it was developed and reviewed that evening, made almost difficult to watch. 11 Bf-100s and 10s were confirmed destroyed in an engagement that lasted less than 8 minutes. 2 P-47s were lost to escorting Bf-109s that intervened. Gabreski was becoming a legend. By the end of February 1944, he had 22 confirmed victories and was the leading active ace in the European theater, a position he held with the same patient, methodical aggression that had characterized his flying from the beginning. He was not the most flamboyant pilot in the group. That distinction belonged to men like Johnson, whose combat reports read like adventure stories. But he was arguably the most complete, the most consistently effective, the most dangerous to encounter in the sky. German pilots in the Jagdgeschwader facing the 56th had begun to be briefed specifically on Gabreski's aircraft markings. Being warned about a specific enemy pilot by name was a distinction that very few Allied airmen achieved. The spring of 1944 brought the campaign against the German transportation network, the systematic destruction of the rail system, road bridges, fuel depots, and repair facilities that sustained the Wehrmacht's ability to move troops and supplies across occupied Europe. This was preparation for Operation Overlord, the invasion of Normandy that was being planned for the early summer, and it required the fighter bombers to operate at their most dangerous altitudes, against targets that were always defended and often located in areas where German flak concentrations were heaviest. The P-47D, the variant that had replaced the earlier C model and that was now equipping most Thunderbolt units, had been modified to carry external ordnance in addition to its 8 machine guns. A single 500-pound general-purpose bomb could be carried under the fuselage centerline, with additional bombs or rockets under the wings. Later in the campaign, the standard ground attack load became 3 500-pound bombs or 10 5-inch high-velocity aircraft rockets, the HVARs that pilots called Holy Moses, which could penetrate the armor of any German armored vehicle then in service and destroy hardened structures that machine gun fire could not damage. The combination of rockets, bombs, and 8 50-caliber machine guns made the P-47D one of the most destructive tactical aircraft of the war. A single Thunderbolt making multiple passes over a German column on a French road in the spring of 1944 could destroy vehicles, scatter infantry, ignite fuel trucks, and leave a road blocked for hours with burning wreckage, work that in the First World War would have required an artillery battery firing for a day to accomplish. Multiplied across entire groups of 60 or 70 aircraft, the effect was catastrophic for German ground forces trying to move in daylight anywhere within range of Allied airfields. The Luftwaffe's ground crews and logistics personnel, the thousands of mechanics, armorers, fuel handlers, and administrative staff who kept the fighter force operational, were living through a progressively more terrifying existence by the spring of 1944. The P-47s and P-51s were hitting the airfields with increasing frequency and ferocity, destroying aircraft on the ground, cratering runways, igniting fuel dumps, killing the technical specialists whose skills took years to develop and could not be quickly replaced. Hermann Göring issued orders forbidding dispersal of aircraft away from their assigned airfields, fearing that dispersal would indicate a lack of fighting spirit, orders that his operational commanders largely ignored because the alternative was watching their aircraft burn on the flight line. By the eve of D-Day, the 5th of June, 1944, the Luftwaffe in the West had been reduced to a force that could contest Allied air superiority in certain areas at certain times, but could not prevent it systematically. The transformation had taken 18 months. It had been accomplished by many things: the B-17s and B-24s hitting the factories, the P-51s ranging to Berlin and beyond, the decisions made at the highest levels of Allied strategy. But at the core of it, in the daily grinding work of escort missions and strafing runs and fighter sweeps over occupied Europe, had been the pilots of the Thunderbolt groups. Men who had taken the big, heavy, ungainly machine that everyone had laughed at and had learned to make it lethal in ways that its critics had never imagined. The joke about the P-47 falling like a safe had long since stopped being funny. The Germans had stopped laughing in the spring of 1943. By the spring of 1944, they had stopped smiling entirely. The 6th of June, 1944, began before dawn over the English Channel. Thousands of ships moved through the darkness toward the Norman coast, and above them, flying continuous patrol at altitudes between 500 and 5,000 feet, were the fighter bombers of the 9th Air Force, P-47 Thunderbolts, painted with broad black and white invasion stripes around their wings and fuselages. The recognition markings that Allied commanders had ordered applied to every tactical aircraft to prevent the catastrophic friendly fire incidents that complex amphibious operations inevitably generated. The Thunderbolts flew that day in conditions that would have grounded them on any ordinary mission. Low cloud, poor visibility, ground fire from every hedgerow and farmhouse along the Norman coast. They flew close support for the infantry struggling up the beaches, attacking German strongpoints, artillery positions, and the armored vehicles that were trying to move toward the coast to push the landing forces back into the sea. The pilots flew at altitudes so low that some returned to base with grass and tree branches caught in their landing gear. Several aircraft were lost to small arms fire from the ground. The same rugged airframe that had brought men home from high-altitude engagements with cannon damage, now absorbing rifle fire and light machine gun rounds that would have been trivial in any other context. In the weeks and months that followed the Normandy landings, the P-47 became the signature weapon of Allied tactical air power in Western Europe. The fighter-bomber groups of the 9th Air Force flew in direct support of General Omar Bradley's 1st Army and General George Patton's 3rd Army as they broke out of the Normandy beachhead and drove east across France. The German armored divisions, the Panzer Lehr, the 2nd SS Panzer, the 12th SS Panzer, discovered that movement in daylight within range of Allied airfields was effectively suicidal. The Operation Cobra breakout of late July 1944 was made possible in significant part by several days of concentrated air attack that destroyed the German defensive positions at St. Lo and left the Wehrmacht's forces in Normandy unable to reconstitute a coherent defensive line. Gabi Gabreski, who had spent 18 months building his score to 28 confirmed victories, making him the highest-scoring American ace in the European theater, was shot down on the 20th of July, 1944, not in air-to-air combat, but on a strafing run against a German airfield. Flying too low on his final pass, his propeller struck the ground and he was forced to land in a field in Germany. He spent the rest of the war as a prisoner at Stalag Luft 1 in Barth on the Baltic coast. His score of 28 aerial victories stood as the American record in Europe for the duration. Bob Johnson completed his combat tour in May of 1944 with 27 confirmed victories and returned to the United States, where he spent the rest of the war as a test pilot and public figure. The kind of role that the Army Air Forces assigned to its most celebrated combat pilots to maintain public morale and support for the war effort. Hub Zemke was himself shot down in October of 1944, his P-51, he had finally transitioned, breaking up in a thunderstorm over Germany. He too became a prisoner of war and, in a remarkable turn, took command of the American prisoners at Stalag Luft 1, organizing them with the same disciplined intelligence he had brought to the Wolfpack. The P-47 Thunderbolt remained in frontline service until the last day of the war in Europe. By May of 1945, Republic Aviation had built 15,686 Thunderbolts, more than any other American fighter of the war. The aircraft served in every theater: the Pacific, where it flew ground attack missions in the island campaigns and over the Philippines; the Mediterranean, where the 12th Air Force used it against German and Italian positions in Italy and southern France; the China-Burma-India theater, where it attacked Japanese supply lines over some of the most inhospitable terrain on Earth. In the hands of the Brazilian Expeditionary Force, the only Latin American combat unit to fight in Europe, it flew missions over the Po Valley in the final months of the Italian campaign. The Luftwaffe pilots who survived the war and wrote their memoirs in the decades that followed were notably consistent in their assessments of the Thunderbolt. They respected it. Several of the surviving Experten, men like Heinz Bahr and Walter Krupinski, who had accumulated hundreds of aerial victories on the eastern and western fronts, acknowledged that the P-47 at altitude was among the most dangerous opponents they had faced. The combination of firepower, structural toughness, and the energy-fighting tactics that Zemke and his pilots had developed made it an aircraft that rewarded the disciplined and punished the careless, with a consistency that experience had taught them to take seriously. The laughter that had greeted the Thunderbolt's arrival in England in the winter of 1942 was understandable. The machine looked wrong. It violated the aesthetic principles that 2 decades of fighter aircraft development had established. The principle that a fighter should be light, fast, elegant, minimal. The P-47 was none of these things. It was heavy, complex, massive, and built with a disregard for elegance that reflected its designer's priorities: power, durability, and the ability to bring its pilot home from situations that would kill him in anything else. Alexander Kartveli, the Georgian émigré who had designed it, lived to see his creation vindicated completely. He continued designing aircraft for Republic Aviation after the war, his work eventually producing the F-84 Thunderjet and the F-105 Thunder Chief, aircraft that carried the Thunderbolt's legacy of ruggedness and firepower into the jet age. He never seemed particularly interested in the praise that came his way. He had known what the P-47 was capable of before anyone else did. He had simply been waiting for the rest of the world to catch up. The men who flew it, the young Americans from Montana and Ohio and Pennsylvania and Texas, who had climbed into its massive cockpit in the winter of 1943, not entirely sure what they had been given, understood it by the end in a way that went beyond technical appreciation. The Thunderbolt had kept them alive in circumstances where other aircraft would have killed them. It had given them the altitude, the speed and the dive, the firepower and the structural integrity to fight and survive and fight again. They had trusted it with their lives, repeatedly, over 3 years of the most dangerous flying in history, and it had earned that trust in the only currency that mattered. The sky over Europe in 1945 was quiet in a way it had not been since 1939. The Luftwaffe that had laughed at the fat American fighter was gone. Not defeated in a single decisive engagement, but ground down over months and years of attrition. Its best pilots dead, its factories destroyed, its fuel exhausted. The silence it left behind was the final answer to the laughter of 1942. The Thunderbolt had spoken, loudly, repeatedly, and with 8 50 caliber guns. The end.